Hello, and welcome to Moonshot webinar on venture viability. I'm Harsh Mishra, your faculty at Quantic with subject matter expertise in entrepreneurship and leadership. Before Quantic, I was a faculty at business schools in the United States, and I have visited and worked with institutions around the globe. More interestingly, I have been an entrepreneur for several years in the space of entrepreneurial learning, and I have mentored scores of early and advanced stage startups. I have also participated in building entrepreneurial ecosystems in diverse parts of the world, starting with New York region back in 2001 to 2008. I have worked for large corporations in the early years of my career, but my interests have all along been in startups ever since the early 90s. All right, so first, let's spell out the Quantic context for this webinar. We have observed that a large number of capstone projects at Quantic EMBA program have been entrepreneurial in nature. Therefore, the idea of Moonshot came along to encourage several of these entrepreneurial ventures so that they revive and make progress in their real world. Quantic is to be a catalyst that further ignites your entrepreneurial potential and aspirations. So it is not just the dispensing of the prize money or investment to winning startups, but it also has the objective of further encouraging your entrepreneurial process, a journey ahead. And why have we chosen viability as this webinar's topic? It is because viability of a venture is one of the most critical aspects to watch out for. That is why it is the first evaluation criteria to be used by Quantic faculty in the first round of Moonshot by your peer group voting at the second stage of shortlisting, as well as the guest experts who will evaluate the ventures in the final round of the Moonshot competition. Do make a note, when we say viability, we invariably also mean sustainability of your venture. These two are interdependent and correlated concepts. So we think that there is an important work ahead, invariably for all of you who are pursuing new ventures or startups. It is to make your ventures increasingly viable by doing a few things. First, pay attention and notice that your venture model might have been influenced by your background of working in a non-startup or in a large corporation. Realize that the context of an established company is substantially different from the realities of a startup. Hence, there is need to infuse appropriate startup sensibilities into your venture to increase your viability. And taking it beyond your Quantic capstone project, we realize that your proposed business model or strategy would need to be made more dynamic by learning from your real market or customers in systematic manner, deploying a methodology that is scientific and market-oriented. So how do we kick off this process today? First, we will touch on highly practical framework to improve the viability of your venture. It is called the Lean methodology. It can set you on the journey from where you currently are to your MVP, that is your minimum viable product. The framework should take 25 to 30 minutes at best. This would be followed by a 10-minute Q&A on the topic of Lean methodology. We will then break out into small groups and engage in an exercise for 20 minutes. I will elaborate on the group exercise before we break out for it. Finally, we will reassemble and hear the testimony from a few venture founders about the change that they feel they need to seriously consider after they have pitched and given feedback by others in their respective breakout group. The objective of this exercise is for venture founders to improve the viability of their venture. Now on the topic of Lean methodology for enhancing startup viability. So first, what is the relevance of Lean methodology? First reason why we are discussing this is because there is a high startup failure rate, more than 70%. That means less than 1/4 of startups really succeed. Given this truth in the matter, recently an important countervailing force has emerged, one that can make the process of starting a company less risky. This methodology is called the lean startup. Startups use lean methodology to improve their viability and reduce the probability of their failure. This is the relevance of lean approach. This is why startups adopt lean methodology. My own experience as a startup founder has been that a systematic, iterative, and progressive learning from short-run failures is the very fuel for improving the probability of one's success as a startup. Lean methodology reduces the risk of failures and enhances viability. After establishing its relevance for startup success, let's dive into what does the concept of lean methodology mean? It goes as follows. First, lean methodology is a choice of experimentation over elaborate planning. In elaborate planning, the assumption is that it is possible to figure out most of the unknowns of a business in advance before you raise money and actually execute the idea. But we know that business plans rarely survive first contact with customers. As a famous boxer said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Too elaborate a planning is generally fiction, and dreaming them up is almost always a waste of time. Startups are not smaller versions of large companies. Their context is very different. They do not unfold in accordance with master plans. Second, lean methodology prioritizes customer feedback over intuition. You can design great products in the comforts at your laboratories, but the lean methodology tells us that only after building and launching the product does the venture get substantial feedback from customers. When the sales force attempts to sell it, and too often, after months or even years of development, entrepreneurs learn the hard way that customers do not need or want most of the product's features. The startups that ultimately succeed go quickly from failure to failure, all the while adapting, iterating on, and improving their initial ideas as they continually learn from customers. Third, in using lean methodology, startups choose to iterate designs repeatedly and incrementally over the traditional big upfront design approach. It uses agile development techniques to do that. Long product development cycles presuppose knowledge of customers' problems and product needs, whereas agile development eliminates wasted time and resources by developing the product iteratively and incrementally. It is the process by which startups create the minimum viable products they test. In the lean methodology approach, the concepts of MVP, or minimum viable product, and pivoting are the central concerns of the lean methodology. In the startup world, operating in a stealth mode is declining in popularity. What is more critical is customer feedback. Aligning customers with your idea or solution matters more than secrecy, and constant feedback yields better results. So quite likely you would have heard of lean startups. It is becoming well known in the startup world these days. And the terms pivoting and MVP, you would have surely heard of. Okay, in case anyone has not paid attention, it is defined as we'll do briefly here. Note that all these terminologies are from the framework of lean methodology. Lean startup. A lean startup is a startup that is consciously or subconsciously using the lean methodology to build itself. Pivoting. Pivoting is a startup changing its strategy without changing its vision. And MVP. MVP is building viability into a product or business model before any major market launch through an interactive and market sensing process using minimum resources. Resources meaning time and money. But before we dive into further defining the lean methodology, first a bit of recent history of this methodology. and more importantly, the relevance of it all to answer why this methodology. History. It is quite a proven history there, a respectable one that too. First, this methodology has been predicted by many successful startups, as I earlier said, practiced implicitly or explicitly. Second, many of these startups have been inspired by the lean management or manufacturing practices used for decades by Toyota and likes, and scores of other successful MNCs worldwide. Third, at least some of you would have heard of Deming's framework and his work on total quality management. TQM has several characteristics that resembles the lean methodology. The methodology was a great business success since the 70s. And coming to the world of strategy, lean methodology resembles the Mintzberg Learning School, which is in debate with the strategic positioning or the frameworks like the 5 forces model practiced by Michael Porter and his likes in the design school that you already are very familiar with, or you would become very familiar with it in course of your capstone project work. Oh, you have already done that. So, but last but not the least, in the entrepreneurial world, the lean methodology has been taking on a greater sense of relevance and urgency. Also, startups have taken this lean methodology to a new level altogether. So again, with that history, what is the lean methodology for enhancing startup viability? This methodology recognizes that all too often, after months and years of development, entrepreneurs learn the hard way that customers do not need or want most of the product's features. In contrast, the startups that ultimately succeed go quickly from pivot to pivot, from failure to failure, all the while adapting, iterating on, and improving their initial ideas, business models, or strategy as they continuously and rapidly learn from their customers. So developing a product in isolation from the market is often doomed to failure, whereas a lean methodology for developing a product or service in interaction with the discovered customer reduces risk and enhances the chances of success. So learning from the customers or co-creating with your market is the central characteristics of lean methodology. So what are the key principles of lean methodology? Startups rather fail fast and frequent to prevent their failing altogether. What does this paradox mean? It means remove the fear of failure, grow confident to not fail ultimately, and learn about success from the process of conscious and expected failing. So the principles are fail fast to change. It is a hypothesis. If a hypothesis fails, pivot quickly and learn continuously and decisively. Over the course, these lean principles could reduce the risk of failing substantially for new ventures. Broadly speaking, constraints and the context are changing for the startups. Startups can have a lower probability of failure. In the past, growth and survival of startups were constrained by several factors, and let's list some of them out here. First, the high cost of getting the first customer and even higher cost of getting the product wrong. Second, the long technology development cycles. Third, the limited number of people with an appetite for risks inherent in founding or working at a startup. So this also functions as a constraint. Fourth, decentralization of access to financing. So venture capital used to be a tight club of formal firms clustered near Silicon Valley, Boston, and New York. But in today's entrepreneurial ecosystem, there are small-sized players. Worldwide, hundreds of accelerators like Y Combinator have begun to formalize seed investments. And crowdsourcing sites like Kickstarters provide another more democratic method of financing startups. Fifth is the concentration of real expertise in how to build startups. So these expertise were fairly concentrated, but all across the world, you could now find entrepreneurial hotspots. Sixth, the instantaneous availability of information is also a boon to today's new ventures. Before the internet, we all know, new company founders found getting advice difficult from experienced investors or entrepreneurs. But today, the biggest challenge is sorting through the overwhelming amount of startup advice you can get. So it has changed altogether. The lean concepts provide a framework that helps you differentiate the good from the bad amidst this plethora of information and democratization of funding and knowledge on startups. Now, let's use the analogy of a small airplane on a runway speeding to take off to understand the lean methodology for enhancing startup viability. It's a very effective analogy. Let's also add the constraints such as the stage of aircraft development, how it must have been at an early stage, going back to Wright brothers in the early years of the 20th century, around 1908 or 9. Let us also simulate the constraints of a small and limited length of the airstrip available to a small plane to take off. So a small runway, limited. And the third constraint of fast and unpredictable wind. Dealing with the unpredictable wind to get the necessary lift, balancing the aircraft and advancing it, it is a process aiming to soar amidst this high degree of uncertainty and constraints. It's a good factor to take into consideration. We can imagine that the small plane has to be strategizing constantly, pivot continuously if some strategy did not produce desired results. Learn and deploy the new learning. Maximum number of necessary strategic shifts at shortest possible intervals. The true mission of a small airplane is to take off and complete the flight. It is not meant to conserve resources, rather to burn out fuel whenever needed to give necessary speed or momentum for takeoff, especially on a small airstrip, that too on a windy day, even with a nascent technology. As a startup founder, I hope you can feel like the pilot of this small plane, like the Wright brothers. If you can sense it, your mind must be working like a mind that is using the lean methodology. Here is a small video of a small plane takeoff. Let's watch it. Exciting. Okay, so there are numerous examples of lean methodology in action, bringing traction to a startup. Blue River Technology, for example, they came up with the idea of robotic lawnmowers for commercial usage. and initially for the market such as golf courses. But after using the lean methodology, once they repeatedly got out to the market to test the waters, that is after talking to over 100 customers in 10 weeks, they learned and moved from the commercial spaces to the farmers and found a huge demand for an automated robotic way to kill weeds without chemicals. So the farmers became their true market after pivoting. Here is another example of a startup using lean methodology. A startup with a battery product, a startup I cannot name, it applied lean methodology. They started searching for a business model and engaged in customer discovery. They met face to face with dozens of global prospects to explore potential new markets and applications. By the way, these were not sales calls. The team members left their PowerPoint slides behind and listened to customers' issues and frustrations with their status quo. They dug deep to learn how customers bought industrial batteries, how often they use them, and the operating conditions. And with this feedback, they made a major shift in their customer focus. You must have also heard of the concept of strategic trade-off and perhaps also used it for yourself. How a startup continues to persevere on the initially chosen strategic path versus the pressures of pivoting as necessary after the strategic learning. It is not easy for any startup to pivot, but the smart ones get to recognize it, embrace it, and they pivot swiftly to charge the lean course. They reap the benefits of such strategic decisions without losing their true vision or value proposition. Now, if you look at Mintzberg School of Strategic Learning and Execution, so every new business entity that includes new ventures has an intended vision that it wants to realize, and it uses a deliberate strategy. However, due to the unpredictable and uncertain environment and factors out of their control, that a new venture faces some part of their deliberate strategy that goes unrealized. Executing the venture forward also brings about a new sense of market or industry reality. A critical customer feedback emerges, for example, that requires a strategic shift by the venture, and a new strategy emerges going forward. Hence, the realized strategy is not the same as intended vision. And what we get is a combination of some part of the deliberate strategy joined by the emergent strategy to give a new realized vision for the venture. There is a pressing need for pivoting, but that need clashes with the earlier need to maintain and persevere on the status quo. Entrepreneurs could be in love with their initial strategy and resist changing to a new one or to pivot. Lean processes in a startup tries to capture the emerging scenario and pivot meaningfully. New ventures listen to customers' identity. Listening to customers helps startups recognize a new business model, which is a primary task that a startup must anyway engage in. This is entirely different from executing against a given model, which is what established firms do. New ventures search for a business model, as on the left. Startups iteratively discover their customers and engage further in customer validation. Whereas established companies execute against a designed or planned business model, as on the right. Established companies have already created their customers and only need to expand and scale on company building. The lean methodology practiced by startups move from pivot to pivot advancing closer to their MVP or the minimum viable product. We can gain an understanding of the lean methodology also through an understanding of how science progresses. Science takes the approach of experimentation. Hypotheses are conceived that are subsequently accepted or rejected based on the findings of the experiment. If rejected, it is rehypothesized. Scientific processes always begin with a hypothesis to be tested. It identifies and constructs its hypothesis using constructs and variables and their hypothesized interrelationships. It then tests the hypothesis on real data in the field. The data analysis can conclude either way, to accept or reject the hypothesis. If the hypothesis is rejected, the new hypothesis is conceived, just like pivoting in the lean methodology. Hence, the lean methodology is a systematic, open, efficient, and decisive scientific process in a sense for the startup world. Lean methodology is making us move from the traditional business plan approach to the business model approach. More so, lean methodology proposes that the building of a business model be made even more lean. You all must have seen the business model canvas. If not, do have a look. It's a simple framework. It lays out a logical process of proposing a value, creating the value, delivering it to the market, and realizing the value by capturing part of it through profit. Every business entity operates with a business model, consciously or subconsciously. The lean canvas is a basic derivation from the business model canvas, suited for early stage ventures. It is a very primary and focused, before even worrying about the rest of the business model elements, and it is face-to-face with the market. Lean Canvas model focuses fundamentally on understanding and figuring out the problem that exists in the world or the market before even considering its possible solutions. It is listening to the market and looking to find or develop solutions through an innovative, frank, and forthright exchange, direct or indirect. And how to have solution that gives disproportionate or unfair advantage over any other competitor, and figuring out the matrix for measuring a possible value through this process. So do use the lean canvas, going back and forth into those 4 building blocks to make your venture idea more viable. Now for the next 10 minutes, the floor is open for any questions on lean methodology as a tool for making your venture more viable. Over to you. Any questions?